Thank you for having me. The title, of course, refers to the shopping experience. I've written about how the way we think about healthcare is kind of an island in the economy. And all of the assumptions are sort of different than we have about everything else. And we're kind of used to them. And it's what I want to talk about today in connection with this company that we're building. I don't like to start a talk without reminding myself, at least, why it is I got interested in healthcare. I'm not a doctor. I, in fact, am terrified of medicine. And I don't really know anything about medicine, as I'm sure my talk will demonstrate. What I am is somebody who lost his father to a hospital-acquired infection, and then found out shortly after that really terrible experience just how common that was, how prevalent it was, how it was also regarded as something that was not entirely but mostly preventable, and almost certainly in cases like my father's, who had been a well man when he went into the hospital for a test and was accidentally given a central line, incredibly enough, from which he was infected and ultimately never left that hospital. All of my work since then, and it's now been 14 years, has been about this one idea of how the things we've done to protect ourselves in healthcare, not just financially, which is mostly turn over our normal role as consumers and even as patients to someone to represent us, either an insurance company, or a government agency, or some other intermediary. How in our effort to protect ourselves, in some ways, we've lost one of the key things that makes things better in the world, that loop, that feedback loop between seller and buyer. It's something kind of crude that we rarely say in healthcare, but that sort of organic relationship that makes things better. The flip side of that is also in having government be the customer of healthcare, be our essentially be a partner of the industry, we've lost its value as a regulator. I want to talk, before getting into this extraordinary opportunity to shill for my company, about a pet peeve of mine. I was born in 1960, and I'm not bragging. One of the things about getting to a certain stage in life is you can think about some of the exciting times that you lived in. And think about how much the world has changed since 1960. You just scratch the surface of it, right? We've taken 51% of the population and given them equal opportunities to participate in every element of life that hadn't existed for women before. We've extended civil rights among every single human being with this belief that we all have dignity and something to contribute. We have globalized the world. We have personal, professional, trade networks that extend truly globally. Since 1960, several billion people have escaped poverty. We all know, obviously, about the information technology revolution and the mobility revolution and the communications revolution, all the changes in the world that have been just extraordinary in just that very brief period of time. And obviously, a lot has changed in healthcare, too. In 1960, most healthcare was pretty reactive. It's kind of episodic, mostly major things, a little bit, and I know there are a lot of doctors here, but I assume very few of you were practicing in 1960. A little bit of the auto mechanic model, right, which is find something that's broken, fix it to the extent we can. Fast forward to today, almost all of healthcare spending is on chronic conditions. The relationship between the healthcare sector and the patient is far more complex. Most treatments are long-term. It's a very different landscape. The world has changed enormously. And of course, in terms of healthcare policy, since 1960, we've had Medicare and Medicaid and prospective payment system and the Affordable Care Act and CHIPS and HIPAA and the Health Information Technology Act, and I could go on and on and on and on. Change, an enormous amount of change. And so it wouldn't surprise you that the healthcare industry, like every other industry on earth, has been transformed. Maybe not. Maybe not. In 1960, when I was born and America was spending about $200 per person on healthcare, basically 33 cents out of every dollar was spent at hospitals, 10% was spent on drugs. About 25, 26% were spent at physicians' practices. Incredibly enough, 57 years later, with all of that change in demography and social order, in work quality and work, very few people work in dangerous jobs anymore. Smoking, drinking, health policy, you name it, it's exactly the same. Try to think of anything else in human life that has had as little change as the structure of healthcare. I know that I'm preaching a little bit to the converted here. This is a free market organization. And all of us believe in dynamism and entrepreneurship and the value of innovation. But one of the arguments I think those of us who believe in markets don't make enough is that things change. I don't know that you have to argue whether Britain's National Health Service made sense in 1948 or Medicare made sense in 1965. But why on earth would those things still make sense generations later? These are cleverly backwards. When the NHS was created in 1948, the biggest industry in Britain by far was coal mining. There's not a single coal miner in the UK today. You could still flog people in the judicial system as punishment. Only 1 out of 10 British families had access to a car, not owned a car, knew someone who would lend them a car. Think of the US in 1965 when we passed Medicare. It was a much more homogeneous country from a demographic perspective. The average marriage age was 23 for men and 21 for women. 9% of adults went to college or had 4 years of college. In those days, households spent 25% of their income on food, but my favorite one is at the bottom. The average American made a long-distance call every 11 days. The average American now doesn't know what a long-distance call is. We made 120 million telegraph messages when we passed Medicare, not about the passage of Medicare. What a different world, right? We don't have to argue, and I know many people in this room would like to, but I'm not going to do it. We don't have to argue whether these things made sense in the mid-20th century. Maybe they did. Why fight that argument? I can't tell you the number of health conferences I go to where someone brings up Kenneth Arrow's article from 1963, which argued that consumer markets were impossible in healthcare. I would say the same thing. It was 1963. I was 3 years old. Things change. Things change to me is actually the most powerful argument for rethinking healthcare. When you think about the assumptions that go into our healthcare system, and if you want to be a speaker at non-free market healthcare conferences, you will say some of those things, or at least challenge one of the things. Here's the most common one. You can't have a normal market in healthcare because in any given year, almost all healthcare is used by a tiny percentage of the population. It's not a normal consumer market. It can never be a normal consumer market. So when I started talking about healthcare in 2010, this number was 80%. 80% of healthcare was consumed by 10% of the population. Today, the number is 64% of healthcare in any given year. Now, the key, of course, is in any given year, because you know what's interesting? In any given year, 100% of the cars are bought by the top 10% of car buyers. In any given year, 100% of college educations are paid for by the top 10% of college education buyers. 100% of weddings, 100% of refrigerators, by the top 10%. Before I had more material, I would just go on and on for 45 minutes with this chart, but now I can talk about Sesame. But what's interesting about this, and why I talk about healthcare as an island, is if you are a healthcare expert, this never occurs to you. What occurs to you is healthcare must be different because I've never compared it to anything else. Right? How many times have you heard people say, well, healthcare is different? And those people have seemingly no knowledge of anything else in the economy. Now, there's obviously one big difference, right? The people spending all that money on healthcare probably didn't say, this is my year to spend a lot of money on healthcare. Like they did, I'm going to get married, most of which are voluntary. I'm going to buy a car, I'm going to college, what have you, right? That's a big difference. But what makes it different is that this is in any given year. And what it tells us is that throughout the economy, we have figured out lots of ways to finance big expenses that you bear irregularly in your life, other than insurance. In healthcare, we haven't figured out how to do that. And more importantly, in healthcare, we've now taken the ever-growing delta, 20% when I started, not when I started speaking today, but when I started speaking about healthcare a decade ago, now 36%, and pay for it with anything else other than insurance. You know, one of the things I think a lot of us know is, or not a lot of us know, but a lot of us believe outside this room, is the profit motive is one of the things that distinguishes the United States in healthcare, and in itself must be a bad thing. So every year I guest lecture at Harvard College's Introduction to Health Policy course. I'm the one crazy market guy. And every year they rate the best speakers, and it's me and the most leftist person. There's no ideological consistency at all. We're just the most entertaining because we're at the extremes. But I did this slide for them. There's only a handful of industries in which we allow nonprofits and for-profits to compete. Why? Because nonprofits have a huge advantage, right? They don't have to pay taxes. That's not fair. Healthcare is one of them. Now, on the left is one of my favorite New York Times headlines. Let's face it, there are a lot of them. An internal email showed that a for-profit drug company used profit to figure out how to price a drug. This is a big story. Incredible scandal. It's almost too hard to believe. That's why I put the rest of the article in there for those of you who want to read more. It is unreal. That shock about profit in healthcare is one we hear communicated a lot. So I thought, let's look at industries in which nonprofits and for-profits compete. There's three big ones, right? There's education, there's entertainment, and there's healthcare. So here are three gigantic nonprofits. I obviously took Harvard itself, which has by far the largest endowment in the world. It's actually now much above this. And also, for some weird reason, charges the highest tuition. Why does the nonprofit, no profit motive institution that we've allowed to accumulate tax-free, now $50 billion, also need to charge top of the market? M is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is one of the richest art museums in the world. That's not tuition. It charges $25 admission. Why does it charge anything? It's a nonprofit. Why charge people $25 to see these works of art it has acquired for free? And then there's Partners Healthcare. I'm assuming since this is the FMMA, there is nobody here from Partners Healthcare I'm about to insult. But Partners Healthcare, which is the largest hospital chain in the Boston metropolitan area and world famous, is a very wealthy nonprofit. And 3 times in the last decade, the Massachusetts Attorney General has sued it for predatory pricing. None of these have the profit motive. It makes no difference what motive you have. You're still trying to earn a return on your capital. The profit motive in healthcare is one of the most confused and irrelevant things. And in most things, we use profit to drive really good ideas. Not in healthcare. In healthcare, what we've done is we've said, okay, we built these insurance-centered systems for the mid-20th century. It's now 2 decades in the 21st century. These don't match up anymore. It doesn't make sense to have an insurance structure or an employer-driven healthcare structure or massive vertically integrated hospitals deal with problems that are primarily chronic care management and long-term care. So from a top-down basis, we've created a lot of ideas to deal with that. And if you look at any of these sort of big ideas imposed mostly through Medicare, but also through some insurance and to some extent through the Affordable Care Act, what they have in common is a belief that one size must fit all. There's got to be one right way to pay for or organize healthcare that's going to solve all our problems. We just need the smartest people to figure it out and then do it. whether accountable care organizations or patient-centered medical homes. We can figure this out and then impose it on the system. And it's an intellectual problem, and I know, again, I'm preaching to the converted, which is 315 million people, healthcare, fragmented diagnosis, broad variety of ways we react as patients and deal with providers. No, there shouldn't be one way. There should be what we have in everything else that matters, which is a variety of approaches, a variety of models. I know one of everybody's great heroes here is Mao. As Mao said, let 100 flowers bloom. But that's what we need in healthcare. And all of these things don't work. What's fascinating, I saw this terrific study on the patient-centered medical home done by one of its leading proponents, and they'd spent 2 years studying it, and they had found that 2 years of a patient-centered medical home had reduced costs of the patient population of almost 2.5%, which is zero or negative, right? Because if you're in favor of something, you study it and you get to 2%, you got to zero at best. But failure doesn't matter, right? If you have a top-down idea that you're trying to impose on populations, how do you know you failed? You don't. You measure it so that you succeed. Is there any better example of that than accountable care organizations? None of these things start with what everything else in the economy starts with, which is what do consumers actually want? What do patients actually want in our sector? They all start with, how do we make the insurance system work? How do we make what we've built survive? How do we make it manage this new era of care? The rest of the economy starts with somebody saying, how am I going to make a living? Which means I got to figure out what something wants and gives it to them. Obviously, people want healthcare, but how do they want healthcare? One of the great arguments for insurance in the early literature proposing insurance-based safety nets was that even if you believed you could have a consumer structure in healthcare, consumers bought healthcare at a moment of extreme anxiety. They couldn't be counted on to be rational. And I find, by the way, that whenever you hear a healthcare expert talk about the need for a rational consumer, you realize they haven't read any economics since they were in college. Since most of us now know that what we're doing in markets is not dealing with rational consumers, we're dealing with the reality of who we are as people and trying to serve a variety of emotional needs. What do consumers like? They like things that are easy. They like things that are transparent. They like things that hold themselves accountable and make that accountable open. And they like things that genuinely reassure them. I don't know of anybody, and maybe there's someone in this room who disagrees, who has found the experience of getting their health care through an insurer, even Medicare, to be somehow relieving of anxiety, right? I've found it to be the opposite. None of these things that we're used to in the consumer economy exist, and none of them are going to exist in a top-down basis. And so the question is, how much have we given up to get the protection when we lose this? So I did a lot of work writing and talking about it and arguing with policymakers and trying to convince people that this was a good moment to bring more consumer tools into healthcare policy, that things had changed, that you didn't have to go back and relitigate arguments from 1948 or 1963 or 1960, it didn't matter. We're at a moment where the overwhelming majority of US healthcare spending is on chronic conditions, in which the patient isn't bringing in a broken carburetor to be fixed right now and drive off. The patient is presenting with a variety of symptoms or probabilities or risks or lifestyle considerations that will require long-term management, potentially treatment, depending on how serious it is. And that the individualistic elements of that were dominating healthcare. And we were still building our healthcare system as if much of the spending was people having sudden heart attacks or strokes. They still do have heart attacks and strokes, but it is a very small percentage of what we spend our money on and a very small percentage of what we're spending our resources on. Similar to that, behavioral health has become a bigger part of both the demand for care and the type of care that everybody needs to think about when they're providing. The patient's mental state matters. We've seen that more and more important. both as a direct need for behavioral resources and for increasing sophistication about behavioral issues among practitioners across specialties. Well, behavioral health has never worked very well in an insurance-based system, right? Too much individualism, too much variety of diagnosis and treatment, too uncertain what's a cure, what's a time frame for a cure. Things change. And yet, as behavioral health has become more and more important, nobody says, how do we rethink the system to account for that? What we say is, how do we force that into the system so the system doesn't collapse? I, in its early days, served on the board at Expedia. And, we're now so used to things like Expedia. But at the time, and I know this because my mother built a travel agency, sort of a high-touch personal services travel agency. And so I viewed Expedia as competitive with my mother, determined to drive her out of business. That woman never did anything for me. I don't want to get too far afield here. But, I could see the difference between the type of business she did, where travel was relatively opaque, right? A lot of the reason we had travel agencies is we couldn't find competition, even in something as now commoditized airline seats. We needed someone to even find price for us. We couldn't find what hotels were available in any area. There was no competition among pricing. It was hard to find out who allowed kids, who allowed pets, who would get. You couldn't know anything. You couldn't buy anything. Travel in the late 20th century is kind of like healthcare. And yet, what did Expedia do? Expedia created a platform where it became in the interest of airlines and hotels to be open and transparent about pricing. To some extent, they had to, right? You couldn't compete. No hotel can compete now by saying, we'll tell you when we get here what we're charging, right? But they also had to be transparent about everything else. So one of the interesting things about these travel sites is the air business quickly became commoditized. There is no difference that you can find. You think you're finding a difference, but you're really finding a routing difference in price or seat difference or equipment difference. Fundamentally, the same plane flying the same route nonstop between New York and Los Angeles is going to be the same price at each time of day. So it took all of price competition out of the airline business. In the hotel business, it created this incredible differentiation among brands, right? We're the ones with the cool hip bar. It's incredibly loud. You're not going to sleep, but if that's what you want when you go away, we got the great bar in the lobby. We're the ones that let you bring your dog. We're the ones that have free breakfast. We're the ones who have great Wi-Fi. We're the ones who have great gyms. And the level, we don't even realize we're so used to it now. You know what you want in a hotel stay, you can find 5 competitors. Exactly what you want. None of that existed 25 years ago. It wasn't possible. And now, I bet you haven't thought about it for years. And so I had been thinking for a long time, how do you bring something like that for healthcare? There's obviously complexities in healthcare, but people used to believe travel was unbelievably complex, inconceivable people could ever arrange their own travel. For those of you who are concerned, my mother's travel agency is still thriving. Why? Because there's not one size fits all. There's still lots of customers who want that personal touch, who want somebody to hold their hands through it. Great. They have travel agents. The problem in healthcare, of course, is that if you tried to build an Expedia, there are no customers. United Health is not going to buy its healthcare on your exchange, and they're not even going to let their members do it. Medicare's not going to, and state Medicaid agencies aren't going to. So who do you sell to? And so this is the, if we can get the slide back up, thanks. This is the biggest change. This is the change that led us think that this was the time to build something like an Expedia in healthcare. Suddenly, because of a change, one coming out of Obamacare, maybe more than one coming out of Obamacare, and one coming out of a different way we construct insurance, suddenly we have an enormous number of Americans who pay for their healthcare directly. Some know it, some don't. Before the Affordable Care Act, the uninsured in America were 2 types of people. One is long-term uninsured, very low income, often a disability, very little regular employment. There's about 50 to 60% of the unemployed. But the other 40% were very transitional. People between jobs, kids graduating school, someone who just didn't pay a few insurance bills. Literally, the other 40% was just people who were going to be insured only at that moment. There was always a lot of controversy about how you actually measured this. So the Affordable Care Act took both of those groups and insured them. Obviously, the Medicaid expansion took care of most, not quite all, of the 60%. And then the change in parents' policies to 25 took care of a lot of the others. But interestingly, the number of uninsured is no longer really down from the beginning of Obamacare, right? At the beginning, before Obamacare, was at high 40s, maybe low 50 million, depending on time of year, dropped all the way down to high teens and has bounced back up to somewhere in the mid 30s to low 40s, again, depending when you measure it. The difference is who's uninsured. Today, if you are uninsured, you are probably middle income, normal health needs, middle-aged, qualifying for some but not full exchange subsidies, and don't think it's worth it. You are something we have never really had before, or haven't had since 1965, which is a person with an income who is a healthcare shopper. And there's a lot of these people now. There's 30 million of them. There's also a huge number of people who never get reimbursed for anything every year, right? So the average spending on healthcare in the United States is $11,000 a year, but that means nothing, right? If you have a $5,000 commercial deductible for your family, and you are a family with average healthcare needs, you never bust through your deductible. Somebody's got to get really sick. Something's got to happen. There's got to be an accident. So in almost any given year, you're buying all of your healthcare out of pocket. So we looked at that, we looked at those markets, and then we looked at all of the things spent on healthcare that insurance doesn't cover enough, or people choose not to use insurance for. And right now, not right now, this estimate's about a year and a half old, as all of you know, data in healthcare come out fairly slowly, but there's around $250 billion a year spent away from the insurance system, either directly by uninsured people or people explicitly not using their insurance, or by people buying their care through a deductible, paying 100%, being a customer. Half of those people know that they're not using their insurance, the other half don't. And that convinced us that there was finally an opportunity to create something normal in healthcare, kind of a Expedia in healthcare. Sesame is really designed as a platform like Expedia. It is full scope, and it enables the sellers of healthcare, providers, clinics, yes, we even have some hospitals, to sell directly to patients without the administration, without the paperwork, and then importantly, without the collections issues that are imposed by administration, insurance, and paperwork. So the way we work is we have a platform where let's say doctors rather than the broader providers and have to go through the list, but doctors can list their services, whichever services they want, but in plain language, not in codes, with prices that they set for availability that they set. We don't tell you how to practice medicine. We don't tell you what to offer. We don't tell you when to offer it. You do have to be an actual doctor, though. We do check that pretty carefully. And you have to be willing to deal with the accountability that comes from online patients who will rate you and respond. Sesame patients prepay for every services. In a sense, they're buying your services up front, using a credit card or an HSA, a debit card, Bitcoin. We don't take Bitcoin, do we? We don't take Bitcoin. Scratch the Bitcoin. And it's just normal. It's just normal. But what's interesting about Sesame is that that normal experience is reassuring, is easier. When you look at and just to give you a bit of our history, we did this as a beta test in Kansas City in 2019. We were planning to launch in Houston as our first sort of major full scope market in April of 2020. Arguably not ideal timing. when the pandemic hit and all of the physical offices we were representing closed, we built a telemed platform, and let any doctor in America put out a telemed jingle. Instead of renting yourself out to Amwell or Teladoc, you could just put your own name out there at whatever price you wanted. But one of the things that we've seen as we've relaunched the business in the fall and grown it for the past year is that this is actually reassuring. That vision that somebody between you and the doctor would somehow reduce the anxiety, I don't think is true of the contemporary patient anymore, maybe some of them. But fundamentally, we're used to being able to deal directly with people who sell us things, including experts. This feels more comfortable. This ease of use, this buying healthcare like anything else, feels anxiety reducing. And when we talk to patients, one of the reasons is that you've taken something that is very opaque and complex on every level. Finding a doctor in my network, who's available tomorrow, right? Finding the service, making sure that once that service is done and I've been referred for a diagnostic or a specialist or what have you, that information gets the right person I've been referred. Being referred to somebody where I know the price of that, all that stuff. People are just more comfortable when it's right in front of them. Easy, just like anything else. The other thing we've discovered is that everyone talks about lowering the cost of healthcare, by which they kind of mean prices or reimbursement or how much you spend. But Sesame is about prices. And what we've done by reducing paperwork and creating this absolute flexibility for our doctors and prepaying so that you don't turn doctors into collection agents and saving them all the time in which they find their medical education is being used to prepare them to be insurance clerks, that freeing up that time, freeing up that expense, freeing up that complexity means they can practice care more affordably. And then on Sesame, because the way you get patients is, your bio, your ratings, the services you offer, and the prices you charge, they compete on price, happily. Because it's cheaper to serve a Sesame patient. You don't have to worry about collecting the funds. The differences are massive. One of the things that makes us unusual is that we're full scope. There's no reason not to be full scope. We are a platform that physicians can use to list their services. So we're happy for anyone to do so. As a marketing company, we focused really first on Texas and Florida. We do about half of our business in those two states. But starting October, we are going to open up to the entire country. We've recruited 5,000 doctors so far in our markets. That number on October 1st will be 15,000, and will cover the full scope of non-inpatient care everywhere in the United States. And of course, some things that we're bragging about, but even in our first essentially 10 months since we've launched, I think we've sold 250 different services on Sesame. And the other important thing is quality care. One of the things that I would hear when I first started talking about bringing some consumer ideas to healthcare is, well, won't you have a selection problem? Just the worst doctors who can't get any patients, doctors who are desperate for business will list. And more importantly than that, because we all know that's not how it works, is won't they worry that that's what it feels like? I think it tells you a lot about the people who drive healthcare policy that that's the way they think of consumer markets. But we've made extra sure that that is not how Sesame works. My longtime collaborator, Marty McCary, and I have worked to design proprietary ratings and accountability systems. We have had a huge number of physicians involved in every single thing of the design since the beginning. Allison, who has a DPC practice in Kansas City, helped lead our beta test there and is our medical director today. But I think more importantly is something philosophically that a lot of people don't understand, which is almost every doctor I've ever met would describe the insurance relationship as one that impeded the quality of care. I've met very, very few who say, the good news is Blue Cross got involved and that really helped the treatment. And what we discovered from the beginning is that the doctors who came to us, and we have a couple folks in the room who help us recruit new practices to Sesame, so close their ear. I ask you guys to close your ears. We have an enormous number of inbounds. And we have inbounds because philosophically, there's an enormous number of doctors out there who think, if I can just get some of my practice to be direct to patients, I feel I'm a better doctor. And I think that's one of the key we as a company and as a consumer service have to create that sense of certainty and security. That's our obligation. We have to police the platform. We have to provide ratings tools. We have every single interaction reviewed on Sesame. But what's been most interesting, and what I'd love to find a way to communicate, is that the doctors who come to us do so because they think they can provide better care. I think this is one of the profound things that in success, Sesame changes about perception in healthcare. Some of you may know I chair the Leapfrog Group, which is the nonprofit that collects all of the hospital safety data in the country. And before I got to Leapfrog, almost every hospital in America reports to Leapfrog. We used to release the data every year. And I said, releasing all this raw data is not very helpful. There's no consumer who's going to read this. And so for the past 5 years, we've been grading every hospital in America, A, B, C, and F. It comes twice a year, and the Leapfrog ratings, as we predicted, now become a real issue for hospital boards of directors. It's incredibly embarrassing for a board of directors to get an F on safety from Leapfrog. It's had a very positive impact on hospitals trying to. I remember running into the head of one hospital system at a cocktail party. I won't tell you what it is. He said to me, your Leapfrog ratings are ridiculous. It's easy for us to game them just by improving the data. I said, yeah, that was the point. That's not a game. That's what we're trying to get you to do. But one of the things we first saw at Leapfrog that is very profound is that some of the most expensive and best-known hospitals in America were terrible at safety. Very famously, when the grades came out, there were a number of very famous hospitals that got Fs, and their numbers are really bad. So one of the great rules in economics outside of healthcare is that the reason an economic actor does something is because they can. So if you're a big, famous, expensive hospital, you can afford to be bad at safety. It's the same reason as if you open a restaurant that has a magnificent view or is in the middle of a spectacular park. The food doesn't have to be good. People are going to come. Not to say all hospitals were like this. Many were committed from an ethical perspective or from a brand perspective or even from an advertising perspective to be great at safety. But the point is, in health policy's mind, there's a relationship between expense and quality that I think almost all of us in this room know is false. And one of the great things I think we can do in Sesame, as has been done in the rest of the economy, is to break that. Because ultimately it's dangerous to consumers. The doctors on Sesame are not just committed to a direct relationship to the patient. They're committed to the patient knowing it and being able to respond. It's that acceptance of accountability is really the ultimate in saying, I'm confident in the care I'm offering. And it's had an enormous impact on our recruitment because it's been virtuous. It's been a virtuous circle. The other thing we've seen, and we're just starting to see this, but this is ultimately what I'm really excited about. I got a great question about how something like Sesame, which in a way is kind of fee-for-service-y, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be, but you're paying a price for a service, and you may need another one and may need additional service. What you do about bundling and innovation and new types of services and integration across specialties and across traditional ways of selling care. And the answer is you create a platform that has a lot of customers on it, a lot of patients on it, and you let providers innovate. I mean, I used to say that healthcare economists seem to believe that Walmart was created when an angry mob marched on Neiman Marcus and said, we demand lower prices. You always hear from healthcare economists that, shopping in healthcare doesn't work because the consumer just doesn't have enough knowledge. And it's as if they've never participated in the rest of the economy. So most of you, I suspect, shop for nothing. Right? You buy stuff because the sellers have desperately tried to get messages in front of you. Right? What happened with Walmart is they had this brilliant idea. What if we can figure out a way to genuinely charge less for everything? And just say, we charge less for everything. A healthcare economist would walk into Walmart, would grab a tube of toothpaste and would say, well, let's look at the ingredients and price them out and see what the total price of the toothpaste should be. And that's what they think healthcare consumers should do. But we don't do that. That's not how I mean, some people shop for entertainment and recreation, I get that, and some people really care about the price of coffee, others don't. Some people care about the price of a car. Most people care about the price of a car. But there's things that we all really care about, but most things in the world we're being sold to. Yeah, I always ask, how come healthcare doesn't have a Steve Jobs? Well, healthcare's got some of the brightest people in the country, maybe a majority of them. Right? It's not a lack of intellect, it's not a lack of talent. It's there's no one to sell to. Right? Apple would not have worked if you had to sell to CMS. You need customers. You need people to try stuff with. And one of the things I think is most important about Sesame long-term, not near-term, but long-term, is that it turns providers from people who check fee-for-service boxes to figure out what you owe them into innovators, into people trying things. Right after we did our beta in Kansas City, we had a pediatrician who listed late-night in-office hours at something like a 50% premium to her regular rates. Oh, I thought we're a discount site. Well, why is she charging a premium? Because she's competing with the emergency room. Because she knows that in Kansas City, at any given moment, there are parents of a newborn who's got her first fever and are panicked. And are not going to accept, let her sleep through the night. And we'll see what's like in the morning. They gotta have care. Well, now there's a late night pediatrician. Guess what? Blue Cross won't pay a premium for late night. It's the same service. Why should we pay more at 11 at night than 11 in the morning? That's why there are no pediatricians at 11 at night. Not that there's no demand. There's tons of demand, right? I cannot think, unlike people who work at CMS, I cannot think of what makes sense in terms of packaging healthcare. I don't know what should be in a pre-diabetes package. I just know there should be one or 10. I know there are people in this room who have better ideas about that than I do. The purpose of Sesame is to give those people a platform where they can find customers and let these ideas compete. Let these ideas work because they help enough people to be worth the price, like in everything else. The other thing about Sesame is clarity. You know, I think if you spend a lot of time in healthcare, you forget how important clarity is, simplicity. If you've ever read an explanation of benefits, and they're better, they are a lot better. But I remember when I was at Game Show Network, I would get an explanation of benefits and I would realize, I don't understand what this says. Now, keep in mind, I'm a former chief financial officer. I've written books on health insurance. This is my hobby. So what does that feel like to anybody of whom those three things are not true? And so much of the health economy is like that, right? So much of the communication is things that are just so people unfriendly. And what's interesting is this is the most personal service we have. This is the one that involves anxiety and emotion and fear about loved ones and uncertainty. Sesame brings clarity. When you get a service, it's described. When you go see a doctor, there's a good bio. That doctor may add information about, here's what I care most about. Here's what I think I'm best at. Here's what I want you to ask me. When you do something on Sesame, it goes in your shopping history. If you do enough on Sesame, you have something for some reason the rest of the healthcare economy doesn't give you. You have an EHR at your fingertips. It's a shopping history, but it says everything you got. Our doctors make sure you get followed up because they communicate with you through your account, like everything else. I think the most important things about Sesame long-term are the things that I don't know about. The really great platforms in the online world have built things that the people who started it could never have anticipated, because it fundamentally changed the relationships and the incentives in ways that were beyond what was obvious. So most of those things were created somewhere between 1997 and 2010. We're very, very late in healthcare, so we're just bringing to this now things like we saw in travel over 20 years ago. But like in travel, as it works, it will start to do things that we can't anticipate. For example, if this is the type of service that an uninsured person can get, if this is the type of relationship with providers that we can drive for people who right now are disenfranchised and have relatively few choices, what does it do for those people who think they have a lot of choices? How does it change the way we think about the benefits of insurance or other coverage or other ways of relating to the healthcare system as patients? And I know there's a lot of doctors and providers in here, but my perspective is as a consumer, as a patient. I frequently use Airbnb for vacations now. I think as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, if you said to me, hey, how would you feel about renting someone else's house for your vacation? It would have been utterly inconceivable, right? And yet, things change. Possibilities change in everything, but so far in healthcare. And one of the key, I think, insights that I'd like to think that my team and I have is that actually opening up uncertainty, creating platform for innovation, not having to decide everything. And the ultimate selling point of Sesame to doctors has been, we're not going to tell you how to practice medicine. We're not going to tell you how to charge. We're not even going to tell you for what to charge. We've had therapists who've experimented with 5-packs, right? Why sell appointment by appointment? Or different times, right? We've had dynamic pricing. We've had different descriptions of services, packages. We're going to have a lot more of that. The reality is in the healthcare system, we've taken something that I think is true of care, which is it's really reassuring to have someone care for you. I mean, you I'm sure all have seen the data about somebody going to a doctor feels better the second the doctor looks at them. The doctor's done absolutely nothing except been there. Right? And suddenly I feel a little better because someone's caring for me. And that's very human and very natural, and it's thousands of years old, discussed in the Old Testament. But we've taken that into the politics and policy of healthcare too. Surely somebody can make sure that this incredibly complicated system can be run to serve everybody really well. Surely there's got to be some governing authority. And yet everything we know about every other human activity is, particularly the complex ones, the fragmented, the heterogeneous ones, they're unbelievably complicated, no matter how smart you are to figure out. That the elements of dynamism and organic feedback loops have driven so much quality in everything else, while healthcare has in many ways remained frozen despite all the other changes that have occurred. I think we have this fantasy in healthcare that there's a Clint Eastwood. It's why we've created, these gigantic insurance companies and Medicare and all the rest. And what we're trying to do in Sesame is do a little bit of the Cleveland Little from Blazing Saddles. This is the incredible moment, of course, where he takes himself hostage and threatens to shoot himself unless the town does his bidding. We improvise in the economy. We experiment. We try things. We hear what consumers want. We look for groups of consumers for whom something works, understanding it may only work for 5 or 10% of the population, not for 90. 5 or 10% enough is enough to build a practice. Is enough to build a good package of care. We accept this in every single thing we do, except in healthcare. The purpose of the Sesame platform is to allow that type of dynamism in care, to bring benefits to the consumer that the consumer doesn't have now, great prices and great values, doctors who are completely comfortable with transparency and simplicity, and the comfort that comes out of knowing you can always find care. And to our doctors, the ability to find a patient that you can deal with directly without all the cost, complexity, collections issues, and others that come from traditional reimbursed care. I'm not looking to replace insurance. I'm not saying people shouldn't have insurance, but I think this is a very important alternative that can create a lot of very positive things, not just for our patients and our doctors, but for all of us looking at the American healthcare system. And so thank you. Thank you for the time. And I know it's Friday and everybody wants to go have a drink. I know I do. But if there's a question or two, I'm happy to take it, or we can all run off to happy hour. I know I presented that as a kind of balanced question. Really? You have a question? You couldn't take a hit? All right, go ahead.
What are the most important keyword search terms you use to attract patients to Sesame? And then how do you differentiate yourself from ZocDoc?
Oh, okay. So ZocDoc's in a very different business. I like ZocDoc. I used ZocDoc just a couple weeks ago. ZocDoc's primary market is insured people. So what you find out on ZocDoc is, I need an ENT, I have Aetna, I have this plan. Can you find me an ENT who, takes Aetna and is in network in this plan in my neighborhood who can see me tomorrow? It's a booking engine. And interestingly, ZocDoc does something that insurers should do themselves, but since insurers don't really care about individual patients, don't, right? That's a service that should come from your insurer. ZocDoc does it for them and does a terrific job doing it. Sesame is not a booking engine, or primarily a booking engine. We are a platform on which you buy healthcare, buy and sell healthcare. And so most of our customers, well, we don't allow insurance on the platform. There is no reimbursement. We're not asking you to file claims. It's just you're buying services. And so as a result, where some cash pay patients do use ZocDoc, the primary business is that. The other difference, just structurally, which is kind of interesting, is that for ZocDoc's business to work, they need ideally every doctor to participate, right? Because I need to be able to say, oh, you need an ENT in this particular plan. The more ENTs I have, the better chance I have of saying, I have one in your neighborhood available tomorrow. Sesame does not want all doctors to participate. In fact, we have a cap and we have had waiting lists because our goal is a little different. We would like to, as much as possible, within competition, so we don't want just an exclusive provider, but we'd like to aggregate direct pay demand among several handfuls of providers in the market so that they will be the most aggressive about serving this patient. You're not that interested in the direct pay patient if you're getting one a week. But if 10, 15, 20 patients a week are direct pay patients, then you're going to be more aggressive on price, but more than just price, right? You're going to be more aggressive on all of the other information and accountability and responsiveness and working with the e-prescribing tools we have to serve that patient. That's our goal, the best service possible for direct pay patients. So we're not looking for every doctor in the country. We're going to cap at 15,000 at the end of September, and we're only going to grow beyond that if as demand does. We're going to be very, very careful how many physicians we allow on the platform. It's not an open platform. There was another part of the question.
The keyword.
Oh, keywords. Yeah. So, and that is something that's constantly changing. Roughly 50% of our business already is organic. So it's not coming from internet search. It's coming from personal friends of mine. No, it's coming from just broad word of mouth. The other thing about Sesame that we've discovered, and Sesame is growing very, very quickly. So we are growing 10% per week in terms of number of patients. We just started last October, and it's suddenly absolutely accelerated. Like most companies, we're very opportunistic around keywords, right? And since all sorts of care is offered on Sesame, we're not confined to just the handful of keywords that most companies are. But the bulk of our business is about long-term relationships with customers. So even in under a year, we have a large number of patients who've booked 4, 5, 6 times. And the reason that half of our business already as a startup is organic is because a ton of that is repeat and word of mouth. We also get meaningful number of referrals from doctors, including doctors who are not at Sesame. So for example, what we'll have happen in markets where we have full scope now, which are mostly the Texas Triangle and Florida markets, is that primary care doctors will have a cash pay patient or a value conscious patient. And they'll say, you need an MRI, you need a colonoscopy, you need lab work. And the patient will say, I'm going to be paying out of pocket. Your referral, I don't know what the price referral is, but I know there's this service Sesame that you can go find care on. So that's been an important source of patients for us as well.
So how is the Sesame product, or is the Sesame product purchased by employers to incorporate as part of their existing healthcare plan, and is there a charge to the employer for that?
So Sesame today is a direct-to-consumer service. As I mentioned, we've been in effective business for under a year. And the most important thing to us is to build a great brand among consumers by serving them well. We have been contacted by a bunch of sort of innovative brokers and TPAs who have raised that issue with us. And I think we are going to respond with some products that I think work there. I think there's a couple ways we are looking at doing it, and I'm giving away inside information now, but you can't trade our stock, so we're private, so it doesn't matter. But we look at working with some of the non-traditional insurers as a way for, either their beneficiaries to find care under their policy or to find care on the things that the policy excludes. We also have talked to a number of gig economy employers about creating Sesame accounts that instead of, because they're not going to buy insurance for their employees, but they might want to make contributions into Sesame accounts for them. And so that the employer has an ability to buy care with at least some of the employer's contributions. It hasn't been our first priority, but I think, to be candid, this is growing much more rapidly on both sides than we had expected. It is something that I hope we're going to see get done, even in connection with this coming benefits season for employers. Thank you.
Yes. For that half of your target population that does have what might be called a high deductible health plan or equivalent, what mechanisms, if any, do you have currently for those Sesame paid medical costs to be covered under their health plan?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So we don't have specific tools right now because we haven't needed them, except in a couple cases. So what happens is, if you by any chance trip your deductible and you have all these Sesame expenses, we will send them to your plan. The plan's argument for excluding out-of-network is always that out-of-network is more expensive than in-network. So our prices are always cheaper than in-network. So we've never had anybody's insurer say, oh, we won't accept that against the deductible. That is a poor long-term solution because it's an anecdotal one that a startup can do. Over time, our goal would be to get, almost every company in America is now major company is technically self-insured, even if they have basically completely turned their healthcare over to someone else, they're technically self-insured, which means they do have the ability to say to their not insurer, administrator, you must accept Sesame bills against deductibles. So sometime next year, we will start to push that as an automatic option. The key to it is to do it without all the paperwork that turns Sesame into as high cost a platform as your insurer is. And so that's what we're going to insist on. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that we've kept the platform for medical care only. So there's almost nothing on the platform that wouldn't be covered by your plan if you had a full insurance plan. So we don't do some of the outer edges of what can be called healthcare, because we want employers to be able to say, with confidence, if it's a Sesame bill, it's something that would have counted against the deductible and want the administrator to protect it. And that's an important part of our commitment to the providers on the platform as well as to consumers.
So you mentioned that the
when you buy a service individually, it's more fee-for-service-y, but yet the doctors that often would be interested in the direct care market are direct primary care physicians that are interested in a subscription-based service. How do you kind of reconcile the two? Is that a side gig for most of your DPC docs, or how does that work?
I think it varies. We've certainly had DPC docs who have sold subscriptions. I mentioned that Allison, one of our founding docs, is a DPC doc. Some also do some limited fee for service and then limit it to Sesame, right? So they'll do some kind of a la carte to compete with urgent care, and some will do smaller packages around care. I guess the right answer to that is we don't reconcile it, they reconcile it. We really look to the physician to design their listing on Sesame, whatever works in their practice. We've had, I think, a lot of interest from DPC doctors just because philosophically that idea of appealing to patients who are direct pay with a direct relationship is a big part of why they became DPC doctors.
Sounds like you were going to only have on there things that insurance would normally cover, because most of what I do as a physician is doing techniques or processes that aren't typically covered by insurance anyway.
So I try to choose my words carefully, maybe too carefully. I'm not trying to be cute about it. We don't use codes on the platform, and we do have some things that don't translate to codes and that aren't medical services. I think a better way of looking at it is that, maybe a better way of expressing it is that everything on the platform, I think, is something that employers have shown a willingness to consider part of healthcare benefit. Again, I don't view our goal as regulating how care is practiced. And I also want to encourage as much innovation as possible on the platform. But, there are obviously some procedures or some types of therapies that, we don't want to create the perception that we are radically and massively increasing what is a burden. Now, another way to do it, of course, is to let employers just say, here are the types of services that we're willing to go into the deductible here. The good news about the platform we've built is we can do that without any paperwork, right? So if you said, we're not doing any of these 4 wellness categories, Sesame could easily, for your particular company, say, any expense in this category doesn't go against the deductible. It's interesting that when you build a platform from scratch, you wind up having a lot greater flexibility and ease of use and things like that than you would if you're building on a legacy insurance platform, which is old and complex. So I suspect we'll be able to police that even on an employer-by-employer basis. Again, the first priority for us has been to build a great consumer brand and direct-to-consumer. But I think over time, that's a relatively easy thing to address. And forgive me for beating this horse, and may open up, which matters to us a lot, the opportunity for employers to say, I don't need to regulate this as much. I mean, one of the great ironies of high deductible care, which I know many people in this room thought would be much more transformative than it has been, is that we've said to consumers, you can shop around, but by the way, you can only do so in my network, which defeats the whole purpose. And so Sesame is a way to get at that problem, right? Which is we've turned everybody into shoppers and closed all the stores. So I think, to that point, as we do expand more into the employer space, it actually creates an opportunity for employers to say, hey, you're spending your own money, right? The principle of this is, I don't know if I have to say to you, gee, spending $50 of your own money on that feels like a bad use to me or too high a price. It is your money.
Well, there's a lot of very effective treatments out there that are not covered. And that's kind of the key. So, like one of them I do is dextrose prolotherapy. It used to be covered. It was very popular. It's been around for 90 years. It's a very effective technique. But just because insurance doesn't cover it doesn't mean it's not a very good alternative.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. And again, the great thing about building a direct-to-consumer platform is you can have an enormous amount of innovation. As we were thinking about the idea for Sesame, I met with a guy who runs one of the largest drug research foundations in America. I don't want to share the name. And he had called me, and I couldn't imagine why. And he said to me, you know, one of the issues we have is we'll fund the research in an interesting therapy. And we'll get FDA clearance. But we've got to coordinate a hospital and a pharma and the FDA and an insurer, and it takes forever. And we might actually prefer just to list the whole thing on Sesame and then let the pieces fall, then let the hospital say, oh my God, I got to get into that. And I think it's to your point, right, which is that this creates a different type of gatekeeper, which is the consumer and marketability and viability of a treatment. And that should benefit everybody. What's in the name? It's an acronym. No, it's not an acronym. So, I was saving this for my memoirs. Yeah. So it's really simple. We did not want a company that had a healthcare name. We didn't want this to be MD that or RX this or Med that, or we want Sesame to be a great consumer brand with consumer qualities. And so we looked for a word that hadn't been used in healthcare, that was friendly and accessible and softer, that we thought that, and you know, the website right now is sesamecare.com, but we'll change that to Sesame. We're building a brand that says things about the experience of buying healthcare that we don't want associated with the old way of doing healthcare. And we want it to be like everything else, right? Healthcare's the actual provision of care, as many people in this room know, is complicated enough, right? There's a reason people have to go to medical school for a long time and train for a long time. The selling part of it, the relationship to consumer side of it, can be modernized and contemporized. That's what we're trying to do, and that's what the brand's supposed to say. Anyway, thank you everybody for the time. I really appreciate it.